What happens when an HOA decides your private property is actually theirs to control, and they install a massive concrete barrier across your legally owned access road without permission, only to discover they've just sealed off their own community's only alternative exit route during an emergency? Quick note before we begin. This is a fictional, dramatized story for education and entertainment. Any resemblance to real people is coincidental. This story is inspired by common HOA situations people talk about online. All names and details here are fictional. Marcus Chen had spent 15 years carefully maintaining the 5-acre property his grandfather left him in northern Oregon, a beautiful wooded lot with a private gravel road that wound through tall Douglas firs before connecting to County Road 47. And what made the property particularly valuable was that this private road, which Marcus owned outright according to recorded deeds dating back to 1952, also served as the historical access route that predated the Pinewood Estates development built on the adjacent land in 1998. When Pinewood Estates was developed, the original builder had negotiated an easement agreement with Marcus's grandfather, paying a one-time fee and committing to annual maintenance contributions in exchange for allowing the new development's residents to use a portion of Marcus's private road as a secondary access point to the county road, an arrangement that worked perfectly fine for over 2 decades because everyone understood the boundaries, the responsibilities, and most importantly, who actually owned what. Marcus, a civil engineer who specialized in infrastructure projects, had always been meticulous about maintaining detailed records of every property document, survey map, and legal agreement related to his land, storing everything in clearly labeled binders in his home office because he understood that in property disputes, documentation is everything. The trouble started when the Pinewood Estates HOA board underwent a complete turnover in leadership, with Karen Matthews elected as the new president, a woman who had moved to the development just 18 months earlier, but carried herself with the absolute certainty that her 3 decades in corporate management qualified her to run the community like a Fortune 500 company, complete with aggressive expansion of HOA authority into areas that had never previously been under their control. Karen's first target was what she kept calling the unsafe access road situation, referring to Marcus's private road, which she claimed in increasingly heated HOA board meetings was poorly maintained, created liability issues for the development, and needed to be brought under HOA management and control for everyone's safety and property values. Marcus first learned about Karen's campaign when he received a certified letter from the HOA's attorney demanding that he either deed over the portion of the road used by development residents to the HOA for proper professional management, or agree to a new maintenance schedule that would require him to repave the gravel road at his own expense to meet HOA standards for community aesthetics and safety. The letter gave Marcus 30 days to comply or face appropriate legal remedies to protect the interests of Pinewood Estates residents. Marcus responded with his own attorney's letter, politely but firmly explaining that he owned the road outright, that the existing easement agreement already specified maintenance responsibilities which the HOA was required to share, that he had no obligation to upgrade his private gravel road to match the HOA's paved streets, and that any attempt to seize his property or impose unauthorized requirements would be met with immediate legal action. Karen apparently took this as a personal insult and declaration of war, because 3 weeks later, Marcus woke up on a Saturday morning to find a concrete barrier company truck parked at the point where his private road intersected with the Pinewood Estates development boundary, and workers were installing massive concrete jersey barriers across the road, effectively blocking the route that development residents had used for decades as their secondary access to the county road. Marcus immediately drove down to the work site, still in his weekend clothes, and asked the construction foreman who had authorized this work on his private property, and the foreman, looking uncomfortable, showed him a work order signed by Karen Matthews on behalf of the Pinewood Estates HOA, stating that they were closing an unauthorized access point for safety and security purposes. Marcus took photos of everything, the barriers being installed, the work order, the location on his property, and calmly informed the foreman that this was his private land, that no one from the HOA had legal authority to install anything here, and that he was documenting everything for the lawsuit he would be filing. The foreman made a quick phone call, presumably to Karen, then told Marcus that he was just following the work order he'd been given and suggested Marcus take it up with whoever hired him, before continuing with the installation. Within 2 hours, the barrier was complete, a massive line of concrete blocks that completely sealed off the connection between Marcus's private road and the Pinewood Estates development, and Marcus noticed that the workers had installed it on his side of the property line, meaning the HOA had quite literally constructed an unauthorized structure on his land without permission. Let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. If you're finding value in this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you've ever experienced a similar HOA or neighborhood situation, feel free to share your story in the comments. Marcus spent the weekend researching every relevant property law, reviewing his title documents, and preparing a comprehensive response. And what he discovered was fascinating in its implications. The Pinewood Estates development had exactly 2 access points to public roads: the main entrance on Pinewood Drive that connected to Highway 14, and the secondary access through the easement on Marcus's private road that connected to County Road 47. And by blocking the secondary access, Karen had unwittingly created a potential emergency access violation because local fire codes require developments of Pinewood's size to maintain 2 separate routes for emergency vehicle access. But Marcus's discovery went deeper because when he examined the original easement agreement from 1998, he found a clause his grandfather had wisely insisted upon. If the HOA ever interfered with Marcus's use of his own private road or attempted to restrict his access, the easement would automatically terminate and the HOA would lose all rights to use any portion of the road, meaning their residents would be completely cut off from that access route permanently. Marcus also noticed something else in reviewing the property surveys. The Pinewood Estates' main entrance on Pinewood Drive was actually constructed on a strip of land that the county had granted the original developer on a conditional use permit, with one of the conditions being that the development maintain the secondary emergency access route. And if that secondary access was ever permanently blocked or eliminated, the county could revoke the conditional permit and require the development. To create a new Armed with this information, Marcus had his attorney send a letter to Karen and the HOA board laying out the situation in crystal clear terms. The concrete barrier had been installed on Marcus's private property without authorization, constituting trespassing and illegal construction. The installation violated the easement agreement and triggered the termination clause, and the blocking of a secondary access route violated the county's conditional use permit for the main entrance, creating potential liability for the entire development. The letter demanded immediate removal of the barrier, a formal written apology, and payment for damages to his property where the barrier had been installed, and it gave the HOA exactly 7 days to comply before Marcus would file for an emergency injunction and sue for trespassing, property damage, and violation of his deed rights. Karen's response arrived 4 days later, and it was a masterpiece of arrogant legal overreach because her attorney's letter claimed that the HOA had inherent authority to manage all roads providing access to the development regardless of ownership, that Marcus's threats were baseless because the easement agreement was still valid since the HOA hadn't restricted his access to his own property, just the development residents' access to the county road, and that if Marcus proceeded with legal action, the HOA would countersue for his failure to maintain the road to appropriate safety standards and seek damages for the diminished property values their residents would suffer from his hostility and lack of cooperation. Marcus read this letter twice, smiled at the legal errors it contained, and realized that Karen and her attorney had just made this much easier for him because they'd put in writing their claim that they had authority to control his private property and their admission that they deliberately blocked the access route, which would be Exhibit A in his lawsuit. But before filing anything, Marcus decided to do something that would prove his point beyond any doubt. He contacted the same concrete barrier company the HOA had used, arranged for them to install a gate and toll booth system at the main junction where his private road met the county road, the point where anyone traveling on his road would have to pass, whether they were coming from his property or from the old Pinewood Estates secondary access, and he had them install clear signage indicating that this was private property and that any use beyond the property owner's personal access would require payment of a toll fee. The installation took 2 days, and Marcus made sure everything was done to code, with proper permits from the county for the gate structure, clear signage indicating private property, and toll requirements, and even a payment system that could accept both cash and credit cards. He set the toll at $500 per vehicle passage, which was admittedly outrageous but perfectly legal on his own private property, and he posted notices indicating that the toll would be strictly enforced for any unauthorized use of his private road. The genius of Marcus's move became apparent about 4 days later when a major storm system hit the region, bringing heavy rain and flooding that washed out a culvert on Highway 14, the road that the Pinewood Estate's main entrance connected to, and the highway department had to close that section of Highway 14 for emergency repairs that they estimated would take at least 5 to 7 days to complete. This meant that every single resident of Pinewood Estates, all 237 households, suddenly had no way to get in or out of their development except through the secondary access route that connected to County Road 47, the route that went through Marcus's private road, the route that Karen had blocked with concrete barriers 3 weeks earlier, and the route that now had a toll gate requiring $500 per passage. Marcus sat at home that evening watching the local news coverage of the flooding and the Highway 14 closure, knowing exactly what was about to happen, and sure enough, within hours his phone started ringing with calls from Pinewood Estates residents asking if he could open the old access route so they could get to work, get to school, get to medical appointments, and basically continue their lives while the main highway was closed. Marcus politely explained to each caller that he would be happy to allow access to his private road, but that the HOA had installed unauthorized barriers on his property, and according to the easement agreement, their interference had terminated the easement rights, meaning he was under no obligation to provide access, but that he would consider allowing passage for the $500 toll fee that was now posted at his gate, which would cover his costs, his time, and compensation for the HOA's trespassing on his property. The reaction was immediate and intense, with some residents angry at Marcus for what they called price gouging, others angry at the HOA for creating this mess in the first place, and everyone frustrated that they were essentially trapped in their own development with no affordable way out. Karen called an emergency HOA board meeting that very evening, and Marcus received a frantic call from the HOA's attorney the next morning, suddenly very interested in negotiating a resolution to what he now called this unfortunate misunderstanding. Marcus listened to the attorney's proposal, which involved the HOA removing the barriers, acknowledging Marcus's ownership of the road, resuming the maintenance payments they'd stopped making 6 months earlier, and providing a written agreement that they would never again attempt to control or restrict access to his private property, and in exchange, Marcus would remove the toll gate and allow the easement to be reinstated so residents could use the secondary access route again. Marcus considered this for exactly 3 seconds before responding with his counteroffer. The HOA would remove the barriers at their expense and repair any damage to his property where the barriers had been installed. They would pay him $15,000 in compensation for trespassing, unauthorized construction, and legal fees. They would pay all delinquent maintenance contributions for the past 6 months, plus a 20% penalty. They would sign a new easement agreement with stronger protections for his property rights and higher annual maintenance contributions. Karen Matthews would provide a written personal apology admitting the HOA's unauthorized actions, and the HOA would pay for a complete professional survey of all boundary lines to prevent any future disputes about property ownership. The attorney sputtered that this was excessive and that Marcus was taking advantage of the emergency situation, but Marcus calmly pointed out that the HOA had created this emergency by illegally blocking the access route in the first place, that every demand he'd made was reasonable compensation for their violations of his property rights, and that if they didn't agree within 24 hours, he would proceed with filing his lawsuit, and the residents of Pinewood Estates could figure out their transportation situation on their own, perhaps by paying his $500 toll or finding a helicopter service that charged less. The next afternoon, Marcus received a call from a different attorney, one apparently hired by a coalition of Pinewood Estates residents who were fed up with Karen's leadership and the HOA board's handling of the situation, and this attorney asked if Marcus would be willing to meet with some of the residents to discuss a reasonable solution that would get them access to the road while also holding the HOA accountable for what they'd done. Marcus agreed to meet with a group of 5 residents at a coffee shop in town, and the conversation was remarkably productive because these residents understood that Marcus was the wronged party here, that the HOA had violated his property rights, and that he was entitled to fair compensation. And they wanted to make sure that whatever resolution was reached would prevent Karen and the board from pulling something like this again in the future. Together, They worked out a proposal that the residents would present at an emergency HOA meeting they were organizing. The HOA would meet all of Marcus's demands for compensation and the new easement agreement. Karen Matthews would be recalled as HOA president for exceeding her authority and creating this crisis. And the board would establish new policies requiring property owner consent and legal review before taking any action that might affect property outside the HOA's direct ownership. The residents held their emergency meeting 3 days later, and the vote wasn't even close, with over 80% of homeowners supporting the recall of Karen and the acceptance of Marcus's terms, because between the ongoing highway closure and the financial liability of Marcus's potential lawsuit, the community had zero interest in continuing the fight their former president had started. Karen showed up to the meeting and tried to defend her actions, claiming she'd been protecting property values and community standards, but when resident after resident stood up to describe how her unauthorized barrier installation had trapped them in their homes, cost them money and lost work and missed appointments, and potentially exposed the HOA to massive legal liability, her support evaporated completely. The HOA's attorney contacted Marcus the following morning with unconditional acceptance of all his terms, and within 2 weeks, the concrete barriers were removed from his property, the damaged areas were professionally repaired and regraded, the $15,000 compensation check was deposited in his account, all delinquent maintenance fees were paid with penalties, and a new easement agreement was signed and recorded with the county that included crystal clear language about property boundaries,